Crossed Plus 100. Mimic takes place after the events of Crossed Plus 100 and follows the story of Archivist Julie and a Crossed named Fleshcook. Each issue from Crossed Plus 100 is juxtaposed and accompanied by a standalone story from years preceding its timeline. Plus 100 Mimic gives us another glimpse into Salt's plan and how Beauregard Salt had planned for things to happen all at once around the country. So without further ado, let's dive into the story. Crossed Plus 100. Mimic Chapter 1. A Fair Deal. The story begins by showing us the Casper compound, the new human settlement in Casper, Wyoming. Our narrator is Archivist Julie, and she tells us that the settlement was fortified to the teeth to prevent any attacks. All of the members inside had grown soft, and only the old people still feared an imminent attack. And their fears came true one day when one of their own betrayed them, Thomas Price, aka A Crossed, they would come to know as Fleshcook. We see that just like Joker Mercy from Chuga, Fleshcook too was an intelligent Crossed with a burned face that could pass for a human. Archivist Julie tells us that he had been with the settlement for 30 years. He was a valuable asset until one day he randomly turned on them. We then see the siege of the Casper compound as Archivist Julie tells us that one day when the supply train Eisenhower came back to the compound, it was full of the Crossed instead of supplies, and they were all being led by Thomas Akar Fleshcook. And this is corroborated by what we are seeing. Like back in Chuga, Fleshcook leads the charge and orders the Crossed to spare the women and children. And while this was taking place on the surface, down in the bunker, Archivist Julie was holed up alongside other women and children. She was the only one calm enough to keep her head straight, which is why all of them were hounding her for an answer. The screams get closer and louder, and none of them know what they should make of it. All they have are sharp knives to defend themselves, and their chances do not look good. It seems that they all have been conditioned at the camp and have been brought up like soldiers, which is why most of them still expect orders from higher ups. Unfortunately, Archivist Julie is forced to tell them the truth, that they shouldn't expect orders anytime soon based on what she hears going on outside. Their only chance is to kill themselves and their children before the Crossed get to them. One of the women then realizes that the screams have stopped and tries to cheer everyone up by saying that maybe they might have won. After all, Casper Compound is known for its formidable stack of the best weaponry on this side of the continent. But hell breaks loose when she tries to put her ear against the bunker door. A huge explosion forces the doors open and the blast atomizes the woman. Fleshcook marches into the bunker along with the other, Crossed with a huge grin on his face. But when he sees that the women and children are about to kill themselves, he desperately screams for them to stop. He puts his hand up and tells them that he is going to let all of them live. The only ones that will be massacred today are the men of the camp. Fleshcook, it seems, is more smarter than even Joke Mercy himself, because not only does he offer the women freedom, he also offers them revenge. He remembers the women were treated like slaves by the men when he was with them for 30 years, and now that he is offering revenge, he knows they are bound to take the chance. He offers them knives and sends them towards the men that have been tied to stakes. The men abuse them and order them to kill the Crossed, but this, unfortunately for them, only strengthens the women's resolve. The women slash the men's throats and begin to brutally take their lives as Fleshcook walks away from the entire scene with a huge grin on his face. Fleshcook then approaches Archivist Julie and tells her that the commander of the base, Nathan, and some of his men are missing. There likely was a secret escape route from the base that only the higher-ups knew about. Sadly, Julie knows nothing about this because she is just an archivist and one of the support staff. We will learn about this later, but for the sake of brevity, we shall go over this concept of hierarchy in Casper Compound right now in the story. The hierarchy starts with supports, followed by basics, frontlines, and brass. The supports are humans that can't fight and be a part of the forces, so they act as support. They cook, clean, build, scavenge, etc. Basics are humans that have been trained in the way of the armed forces. They have been able to survive the harsh and rigorous training and can now be used as fodder in skirmishes. Frontlines are soldiers who have proven their worth but aren't ready enough yet to be included among the top officers. Brass is a military slang that refers to the highest officers of the base that were privy to all the secrets and everything going around the base. Commander Nathan and the missing officers are supposedly all brass, and Archivist Julie was support and Fleshcook was a frontline. This is why none of them knows about the base's secrets. Fleshcook had expected that Julie wouldn't know about the secret passage, but it was worth a shot. Once they are done conversing, he hands Julie a knife as well and tells her he has a gift for her. Fleshcook then points over his shoulder and we see rage build up in Julie's eyes as she walks towards a man man tied to a stake away from the others. The man tries to establish his authority in this instance by claiming that he is frontline and orders Julie to stand down. But all Julie can remember how this man had forcefully violated her back in the day just because he was frontline. Julie pushes the memory of that horrid night out of her head and then slashes the man's throat. Even in his dying moments, all the man could scream about was his authority and how Julie was a traitor. Julie continues slicing the man's throat and body until the rage in her subsides and her mind takes over once again. She is horrified by what she has just done, but Fleshcook triumphantly smiles in the background. He then addresses Julie and says, too fast, but the spirit's there. It's there with so many of you, just as I'd hoped. Rest now, we'll talk later. He then leads Julie and the rest of the women to their new quarters, as all of them struggle to come to terms with the recent events that just took place. Archivist Julie's narration once again takes over as we see her remember everything she knew about Fleshcook. He was a teenage boy who had randomly shown up outside the Casper compound one day, claiming that his entire clan was wiped out by the Crossed. He had burn scars on his face and gashes on his torso to prove the same. He was reluctantly taken in by the compound's soldiers, but as a way to test him, he was put through even more harsher training in hopes that he would end up in the support team. But Fleshcook, aka Thomas, thrived. He surpassed expectations and ended up becoming the top of the front line. But that is where the promotions ended for the outsiders. He was never taken into the brass. The next day, when Julie is archiving, the rest of the surviving women are busy struggling with the choice they've just made. Some feel that killing the men and joining the Crossed was the right choice, but others are still crying. Julie, meanwhile, is still journaling, trying to make sense of the situation. She can't help but be surprised by Thomas, aka Fleshcook's demeanor and intelligence. She knows she once read about a smart Crossed attacking the Cheyenne Mountain when the outbreak had just happened a year ago, but even that Crossed wasn't as smart as Thomas. Side note, this Cheyenne Mountain attack reference is a callback to Smokey's assault on the facility. As Julie continues to journal, her next words are harshly juxtaposed against what is happening in the background. A woman that had failed to kill the man she was supposed to yesterday is dragged out by Smokey and his men, stating that if she can't fight, she will serve their cause in another way. Everyone in the room knows what this means, and they are once again horrified to the core by this claim. While this is happening, Julie is writing that he never slept with anyone in all those years since Thomas joined the Casper compound, and she found that very odd, especially since it has now been revealed that he is a Crossed. According to Thomas, he can't have sex because a lion mauled his privates while he was out in the wild, and this story was seemingly corroborated by Julie's friend, who once saw him naked in the showers. But Julie still finds this simple fact very odd. In her experience, every man, even the ones that can't make their privates work, find ways to force themselves upon women, find ways to please themselves, and yet, in all her experience and memory, Thomas never slept with anyone. While she pens this down, the woman in the background who is being dragged away is begging for another chance. She is hell-bent on showing the Crossed that she can definitely kill the man now, but everyone knows that it's already too late for her. Julie then journals and tells us about the ranks in the Casper compound, how those who were regarded as support were mostly slaves. They were only good for serving the needs of others, whether it be work or perverse desires. She tells us that this is why most mothers in the compound would prepare their daughters from a young age to marry a frontline soldier. This was the best future a woman could wish for in the compound. This was something Julie tried to defy by becoming an archivist, hoping that it would give her enough independence and authority. But sadly, the world has its ways. As Julie says this, we are shown the memory of Julie busy archiving in the library when the man she killed yesterday hungrily comes and stands in the room while blocking the doorway. She then distracts herself by remembering how the higher-ups and even frontline women soldiers were ruthless. It was the way of the compound. Keeping yourself in demand was the key, because if you got old and your husband wanted a younger wife, you'd be thrown among the support once again. This is when we see a female frontline woman soldier beat up a young woman to death for simply being too enticing for her husband. And this is when we see Julie watching the woman that was taken earlier get dragged into a pen full of naked women. She too has been stripped off of all her clothes, and it seems that the women rounded up in this pen are meant to serve only one purpose, just like before, albeit the Crossed are much more forward about their intentions. A few hours later, Julie is approached by Fleshcook, who shows her the tunnels they have found in the Brass's headquarters. These were the tunnels he suspects Nathan and his men used to make his escape. He asks for Julie's opinion, and she tells him that she suspects that they will make for other nearby fortified settlements. Fortified settlements like the ones in Newcastle and Rap City. She also suspects that they will likely stop in smaller settlements reinforcements on their way there to warn everyone about the attack over the radio net. Thomas, aka Fleshcook, is impressed by her, and this gives Julie an opening to pose the question that has been eating at her. How is Thomas so smart despite being a Crossed? Thomas takes her to the Beauregard Salt shrine they have built in Casper and tells her all about the serial killer, how he was just like the Crossed before being infected, and the infection had no effect on him except for the rash on his face. He tells her that it was Salt who realized early on that their race wouldn't survive long if their ways carried on, which is why he began organizing them, teaching them, forcing them to live a certain way. He tells Julie that Salt had 12 close disciples, of which only 3 remain. One of them is named Happy, and he raised Thomas. Happy is no more, but Thomas still remembers him very fondly. As he goes on to tell Julie about Happy, we are shown flashbacks of Beau Salt with Happy. Apparently, the two of them bonded over their love for fine cooking. We see the two of them meticulously preparing a dish when Happy was in his early teens, and then Beau Salt listening to fine melodies being played by Happy on the piano in his late teens. As this happens, Thomas tells Julie that Salt ultimately tried to instill pursuit of other interests in all his disciples, apart from the usual that the Crossed love: torture, sexual exploitation, murder and pain. He tells Julie that Salt loved these things as much as the other Crossed, but he loved other things too, and he knew teaching the other part to the Crossed would be the key to their success. He goes on to tell Julie that these qualities were passed on to him by Happy because he was his favourite. He then tells Julie it is the reason why he was able to appreciate her ulterior interests as he pulls out a book from the bookshelf. The book is titled Bosch, and it is a book by Hieronymus Bosch, a Dutch painter from the 1500s that often portrayed hellish landscapes in his works that look like the world of the Crossed. Thomas, aka Fleshcook, continues to tell Julie that he always appreciated her archiving historical works of fiction and non-fiction that were frowned upon by the brass. He appreciated her stocking the library with books that weren't about war tactics, strategies, weapon manufacturing and such. Realizing that he has opened up too much, Thomas respectfully tries to leave, but that is when Julie questions his language. Even humans nowadays don't speak so fluently. They speak a broken form of English that has evolved into its own language over the past 100 years, something the archivists call hillbilly talk. Thomas tells her that presentation was of the utmost importance to Happy. That is why he was taught proper English, elocution, and diction is the key to one's presentation. But before Thomas can continue, Julie asks him another question. What's it like being a Crossed? This question pleasantly surprises Thomas. There is a childlike expression on his face when he realizes what Julie is asking and tries to formulate words that can properly express what he wants to say. When he fails to do so, he turns the question around and asks Julie, what's it like being a human? Julie is surprised by this question. Thomas should know what it's like to be human. After all, he deceived the Casper compound for 3 decades. Thomas interrupts her and dismissively tells her that he knows what pretending is like, but he wants to know what being a real human is like. When he sees that Julie can't understand him, he asks the next pertinent question that seems to have been held by him for decades. He asks Julie, what is sad? He knows what it does, how to pretend to be sad, but he doesn't understand what it means or how it feels. A spark ignites in Julie because she can maybe show Thomas what being sad is. She points to his memory of Beau Salt and his longing when showing her the shrine, what he feels when he realizes he never met Salt despite hearing all his great achievements from Happy. The way he feels, this regret and longing, is sadness, and Julie explains this to Thomas. This naturally plunges him into deep thought. He realizes it feels empty yet heavy somehow. It makes him feel weak, and Julie immediately points out that this is what being sad feels like. The two of them have a very intricate moment of respect and mutual admiration after this interaction. Thomas then breaks the silence by saying that the two of them are going to conduct an experiment while at Casper compound because it could prove useful once they have to leave it. He tells Julie that she is going to teach him what it means to be human while at the compound, and in exchange, he will teach her what it means to be the Crossed. Crossed +100, American History X, Year 2060, Survival of the Words. The year is 2060 and a Crossed army is attacking a human settlement. The charge is led by a somewhat smart Crossed woman that is dressed from head to toe in human bones and flesh. Even her horse has been adorned with human bones in some twisted sense of fashion. She wears a dress made of human faces sewn together and carries a flag made from human faces as well. She has shriveled infant heads bracelets for earrings, and a ribcage to adorn her hair. Even her heels are made from the lower part of a human skull and the tailbone from some poor man's spine. As the attack happens, we see a woman holed up in a small room, desperately scribbling into a book. She will be our narrator for the story and tells us that they were all stupid to believe that the Crossed had all died out. There were signs, yes, but they should have realized that it would take at least a few more decades for them to be so low in numbers that they could easily lead their lives. Instead, this lapse in thinking caused this attack, which now has doomed them all. She knew the last year they spent without a Crossed encounter was too good to be true. She can hear the Crossed breaking through the wall that they spent the entire winter making. As she continues her narration, we see that the humans that are fighting back are led by an old man, likely in his 60s or 70s. He is firing an automatic rifle at the hole in the wall while rallying up all his men. But the attack is too huge. There are hundreds of the Crossed, and they seem to be using siege tactics. While some of them invade the settlement through the hole in the wall, others set up ladders to climb over. Another hole in the wall is breached as the woman continues to tell us how even in these times, people who follow a religion kept trying to propagate their views. Every victory was seen as God's wish and wrath, while every failure was seen as something the humans deserved for failing to follow the ways of the gods. She laughs as she tells us that even now, these people are simply praying while the rest fight their fight. She then tells us that even though this is the end, she is going to have her way, even if it's the last time in her life. She won't let the Crossed take her, she will choose her own death. As she says this, we see the Crossed woman who was leading the charge has now entered the compound. She has now removed her top, as though signifying the final assault, as she orders all her followers to get her bones that she can use for her depraved fashion sense. The woman writing the diary sheds tears as she hears more and more of her people outside succumbing to the Crossed. She tells us that in another life she would have done everything in her power to be a fiction writer. Ironically, in her view, she spent the last year doing that anyways, dreaming of a better world that she should have known would never come. She prays that someone in the future finds this book so that her story lives on. She has recorded everything that has happened since they formed this settlement. Through her narration, we learn that the woman's mother and her met up with James, an old survivor who had managed to fend off the Crossed since the outbreak began. James had led them all to this cold area up north where they had killed off every Crossed and claimed the land to make this settlement. They had heard of the Crossed inbreeding down south in the sewers, but had never expected them to come back with an army. She says it was foolish of them to not pay attention to these rumours because it has led them to their demise. We then see the Crossed woman leader scanning the area outside for her next victim until she lays her eyes on James. She realises that he is precious and instantly beelines for him. She climbs on top of him and begins to carve his face while James desperately begs for someone to shoot him to end the misery. As this happens, we see the desperation in the words of our narrator grow. She emphasises how she wishes she could trade places with the person that reads her words in the future, emphasises the importance of recording everything they go through in these times for future generations. She then ends her record of the day with the words, "Remember me, remember what happened." She throws the book out of the window as she hears the Crossed banging on the door to her room. Next, she holds a knife up to her throat and before the Crossed can get to her, slashes it without remorse. In these last moments, her last words in the book read, "My name is Remy Crowell and these are my words. Don't let them go forgotten." While Remy is ending her life, we see that James is living in hell. No one was able to shoot him and his face has been skinned by the Crossed leader. She is violating his skinned face while pleasuring herself and holding up his skin like a mark of victory. However, her triumph is interrupted when the book thrown by Remy lands on James's body. The woman takes a look at the book, reads it a bit. Disgusted by the words it contains, she wipes her crotch with it and then simply tosses it in the fire. The book burns to a crisp as we see the woman rally up the Crossed for another assault and charge into the night. Crossed Plus 100, Mimic Chapter 2, Untouched Bases. This comic begins by showing us the horrific scene of Fleshcook mutilating and cutting himself. Julie is naturally horrified by this, but Fleshcook tells her that this is his form of gratification. As a Crossed, violence, torture and pain are just like sexual pleasure to him, and so he self-harms in order to get this gratification. But he tells Julie that Happy taught him to keep this habit in check, otherwise it would get him killed. He was taught to delay gratification preparation for future pleasure. Happy taught him to keep an eye on the long goal. He then justifies his actions to Julie by telling her that this line maintained between pain and pleasure isn't something new. Humans have been teetering it for a long time. He then shows her books from the past century that showcase bondage, sadomasochism, and more. He tells her that it's just like fine wine. It's an acquired taste. It is then that Julie inquires if his goal is to teach humans to be like the crossed, and this is when Fleshcook explains the intricacies of what he is doing. According to him, teaching through the method of torture and brainwashing was Bashful's realm, something he was quite adept at, but Fleshcook is trying something different, something more nuanced. He gets awfully close to Julie as he tells her that he feels there's a lot more similarities between the crossed and human, according to him, and they need to be explored methodically and intelligently. Julie tries to defy Fleshcook's claims that people can't get satisfaction through the means of hurting someone else, but Julie stops mid-sentence, and Fleshcook knows why. He tells her that the man who assaulted her got pleasure by hurting her, and when she killed him, she felt pleasure too. This moment of realization makes Julie vulnerable, and she is about to touch Fleshcook, which forces him to recoil and stay away from her. Julie was born in this era where teachings of how the infection spread weren't taken seriously, which is Fleshcook has to explain to her that the infection can spread through the means of any body fluid contact, which includes sweat as well. He then answers Julie's question from another perspective. He tells her that when Happy was methodically carving his body using lion paws, he could feel every scar on his body, and he enjoyed it. This time they spent preparing Fleshcook for infiltration was some of the best pleasure Fleshcook has ever felt in his life. Fleshcook's eyes have grown furious in the modern day as he is expressing this to Julie. The crossed streak is more visible on his face, and naturally something is about to take over. He orders Julie to leave abruptly in fear of what he might do if she is still here while he tries to curb his instincts. Julie runs through the camp while witnessing all the violence and depraved acts of pleasure around her. She struggles with all that they talked about today, but we see that she gives in to what Fleshcook told her. She seems to agree with him because that night, the memory of killing her rapist using her own hands makes Julie touch herself. The next day, a huge crossed woman is arguing with Fleshcook in the middle of the compound. He wants to repair the fortifications around Casper compound, but she wants to leave and move on to the next settlement. She also wants to go after Commander Nathan, but Fleshcook isn't having any of it. He wants to stay here and go through all the maps and intel that Casper compound has. They are the foremost militaristic settlement in these times, and he wants to explore and learn everything he has to offer. The crossed woman spits on the ground and claims that Fleshcook is simply staying here because he wants to continue his experiments with Julie. She tells him that he should simply kill Julie and continue the experiment with another archivist. They should be going after Nathan and his officers before they get reinforcements. Fleshcook isn't worried about the escapees because they are on foot. It would take weeks for them to reach a nearby settlement, and it would take more if they're looking to reach fortified and armed settlements. When the woman orders him to do as she says, Fleshcook snarls and says that he doesn't take orders from Sneezy's followers. This is his mission. He has waited 3 decades for this, and they all will do as he says. The confrontation is about to tip into violence, but the woman prevents it from doing so by giving in. She agrees to follow Fleshcook's orders of repairing the fortifications around the compound, but says that once Fleshcook's experiments are finished with Julie, she is going to have her way with her. Fleshcook happily agrees to her demands and tells her that Julie will be his gift to her. The woman walks off angrily, and we see Fleshcook's face reflecting an expression of contemplation, but no one has realized that Julie has been listening to this entire confrontation. She has been hidden behind a nearby shed this entire time. That day, Julie and Fleshcook continue their conversation about the crossed and the humans while taking a walk through the camp. As they pass by a pen full of naked people deemed unworthy of Fleshcook's vision, Fleshcook poses the question of love to Julie. He says that he doesn't understand love and why humans would sacrifice their own life for someone they love. Julie then tries to make Fleshcook realize what love is by asking about Happy. She learns that Happy lived to be an old man until he got cancer. Fleshcook and the others tried to cut the cancer out of him, but the operation failed. This is the exact moment Julie was looking for. She instantly suggests that after the operation failed, they must have killed him. After all, that's what any crossed would do. They would have put the flesh and bones to good use. This suggestion and thought makes Fleshcook recoil in horror. He puts up both of his hands and immediately defends himself. He tells Julie that they did not kill Happy. There was so much they could still learn from him, which is why they let him live. Julie then hammers another nerve by asking what they learned from Happy in his last few years after the operation, and for this, Fleshcook has no answer. They learn nothing yet, they couldn't kill him, and this gives Fleshcook his first glimpse of what love is. Julie emphasizes this, and Fleshcook smiles widely when this realization hits him. He realizes that Happy was special, but he can't understand how humans can have this feeling for everyone around them. Julie tells him that everyone truly loves their families and partners. They don't love the entire race when shit hits the fan. When it concerns the survival of their own families and loved ones, humans will kill each other to save them. This is when Fleshcook hits something profound. He says, "So it's all deception then? A fraud? Like the one I perpetrated in this compound?" Julie falters for a bit, but then tells Fleshcook that he is somewhat right. But unlike him or the Crossed, humans won't kill for the fun of it or for the pleasure of it. They don't have the urge to do it. They only resort to it in survival situations. She tells him that this way, it makes life easier for everyone around them. That night when Julie gets back to her bunk, she is bullied by all the women around her. They all see her as a traitor because she has been revealing all their secrets to Fleshcook. The argument and confrontation grows to a heated stop when Julie screams at the top of her lungs that she is the one keeping them alive. She calls them fools and tells them that Fleshcook is the one keeping all of them alive because they are a part of his experiment. If it was up to the woman who is Sneezy's follower, they would have been long dead. This wins over the other women, and they ask Julie if they will survive long enough till reinforcements return. And this makes Julie finally break down. She is tired of everyone assuming that she knows everything just because she's the archivist. In this moment of vulnerability, one of the women reveals that she was abused by Commander Nathan when she was a young girl. But during those nights, she learnt that the brass kept a radio net communicator hidden for themselves somewhere on the base. Somewhere only the members of the brass could access it. She tells Julie that because she has the privilege of roaming the camp freely, maybe she can find it and call for reinforcements. An old woman has been listening to this entire conversation, and this suggestion makes her stand up and confront them all. She tells them whether the reinforcements come or not, it won't matter. They all will always be slaves. They were slaves when Nathan and his men were in charge of the compound. They're slaves now, while the Crossed are in charge. And once the reinforcements come, they will be slaves again. She then tells them that she had heard of settlements in the country where everyone lived as equals, where people had families, communities, markets, and more. She tells them all that it was her dream to leave Casper Compound and go to one of these settlements when she was young, a dream that is futile now. As she says this, she simply walks out of their quarters, and Julie desperately tries to stop her from going out. But the old woman simply keeps walking. As Julie screams for her, we learn her name for the first time, Sally. Julie isn't going out because she knows she would be killed, but Sally is nonchalantly walking over to two crossed men. When they notice her, she picks up a gun from the table in front of them and shoots herself in the head. This horrific scene, however, emboldens Julie's resolve further. However, this sacrifice does the opposite for Julie. She is now more emboldened than ever to find the hidden radio net and hits the jackpot the next day. She realizes that the only place on the base that was restricted to the brass were the brass toilets, something she is sure that even the Crossed haven't checked yet. She heads inside and her eyes light up when hidden underneath an unused pot, she finds a radio net communicator. Julie is about to use it when she suddenly remembers Sally's death and sacrifice, and she decides against it. She goes back only to realize Fleshcook has a new activity planned for them. They are all going to face recently turned Crossed in a physical confrontation. He tells them the basics, tells them that their protective gear should protect against spilled blood, and then unleashes the Crossed upon them. If they live, and his experiment is to carry on, they need to overcome this hurdle. Reluctantly, the women jump into action and kill off the Crossed one by one. Some use machetes, some axes, and some use guns, but by the end of it, they manage to finish everyone. Fleshcook is impressed, but the woman who is Sleepy's disciple isn't. She feels that they all had an advantage thanks to their protective gear. Fleshcook can't help but agree with her, but he also realizes that they need to take things one step at a time. As all of them are removing their gear, the woman who had informed Archivist Julie about the radio net communicator looks down at her torso and realizes that she has a gaping wound on her chest. The next moment she turns into the Crossed, and this makes the Crossed woman instantly spear her in the face. We learn that the woman's name was Martha, and her death has hit Julie like a bullet. She tries to contain her tears as she watches the crossed woman methodically and happily gore Martha's face again and again till she no longer moves. Fleshcook feels that Martha's loss is a tragedy, but the experiment was a success. In order to keep up appearances, Julie agrees with him, but runs away to her quarters before she breaks down completely. That night, Julie gives in and uses the RadioNet communicator. At first, there is no response, and Julie chides herself for being hopeful, but then, minutes later, she hears Commander Nathan's voice on the other end. When she asks what Nathan's status is, he tells her that they are getting ready to wipe off every crossed in Casper compound. This is when we get our first look at Nathan. He has been mobilizing an army, and the army seems to be equipped to the brim. They have fortified trucks, heavy weaponry, and numerous soldiers at their disposal. Crossed Plus 100, American History X, Year 2076. There is no running from nature. It wasn't just humans that were faced with harsh realities in the past 100 years since the outbreak. The Crossed were having their own epiphanies. And this is the story of three Crossed realizing that nature has its way of correcting itself, no matter the chaos that ensues in the world. The story starts by showing us four Crossed running in the wild, desperately trying to get away from something. Two men and a woman are trailed by another heavy cross that is lagging behind. The men and the woman seem to be smarter because they are cursing under their breath, expecting the worst fate, while the heavy-set crossed is too busy thinking about pleasuring himself. As the three of them beeline for a nearby building, we see the heavy-set crossed get ambushed by a huge figure that instantly rips the crossed's throat apart. The other three crossed, meanwhile, get into the building and hold the metal doors shut. When they realize that their companion, the injured man, would no longer survive, they use his bones to lock up the door while leaving his mutilated body as a twisted offering for the entity that is hunting them. The man and woman continue exploring the building, and we realize that it is a long abandoned shopping mall. They are currently in a clothing store, and when both of them are distracted by mannequins, we see the woman suddenly get pulled into the dark as a huge stream of blood splatters into the air. The man, clearly spooked to his core, watches in horror as a lion pulls out the woman's innards and feasts on her flesh. Over the past stories we have covered, we have learnt that animals aren't affected by the C virus, but the crossed around the world have had to learn this the hard way over the years, just like this crossed man now. Overcome by his desire for violence, the man tries to join the lion in mutilating the woman's body, but this is when the lion stares at the man, and the displeasure and anger in its eyes is quite apparent. And so the chase begins, and although the man tries to run away, he is quickly taken down by a second lion from the pack. Then a third one joins the feast, the one that was being held back by the door they barred earlier. And this is the end for the crossed man. With a swift move, the three lions shred the man's body to pieces in an instant. They roar loudly in the shopping mall as the camera pans out and shows us the entire city. It has been taken over by trees, vegetation, various animals, and all forms of tropical birds. Rivers freely flow through the street, and we see that this is what a modern-day jungle looks like. A modern-day jungle ruled by its kings, the lions. Crossed Plus 100 Mimic, Chapter 3, Rising Tensions. The story begins by showing us the conversation between Archivist Julie and Nathan. Commander Nathan is awfully cordial with Julie this time, contrary to his reputation, and it's apparent why. It's because he needs valuable intel from her. Julie learns that the commander and the officers managed to encounter a scavenging party out of Newcastle, allowing them to get in touch with other settlements. They are currently busy mobilizing forces and planning a counterattack. When Commander Nathan asks Julie for her opinion on whether they should attack now or wait for backup, Julie's heart stops for a second. Never in her life had she imagined the commander asking for her opinion, let alone resting the faith of an attack on it. She falters and hesitates, and then finally tells Nathan that they have enough time to wait for backup. She talks about Fleshcook's plans to fortify the compound and how tensions have been rising among the Crost's ranks. It is then revealed that the woman who has been against Fleshcook all this while, the one who is Sleepy's disciple, is named Bolsack. When asked about how the survivors are doing, Julie tells Nathan that the old people were used for food while the young and supports are being held in pens for breeding. She tells him that all soldiers have either been turned or have been killed, and this is when Nathan promises to save them all. Julie too conveniently leaves out Fleshcook's experiment with the ladies during this exchange. As the conversation conversation ends, Nathan promises to make Julie a soldier once all of this ends. Her intel will be vital to their attack, and she will be given a promotion in exchange for it, something that has never happened before. Julie is shocked to her core, and unable to contain her excitement, she fails to notice the noise outside. She quickly turns off the communicator, only to find Fleshcook already there, waiting for her. She makes the excuse of using the brass washroom whenever she gets the chance, just because it has been kept off limits for her all her life, and Fleshcook likes this. Although a petty act, Fleshcook too decides to do the same and goes in to use the washroom as Julie walks away with fear running down her spine. She then comes across two crossed that are chopping up bodies to be used as food, and they begin acting out and violating the dismembered bodies in order to get a reaction out of Julie. But in this moment, Julie realizes what Fleshcook has been teaching her. She is being taught to have no fear, just like the crossed, and so she sheds all her fear in this moment and simply continues walking. The two crossed stop dead in their tracks when they see that they are getting no reaction out of her and go back to doing their job. We then catch up with Julie at the workshop, where a human man has been tied up with half of his face already flayed. Julie is supposed to continue torturing this man, but she is making Fleshcook realize that she can't carry out such acts on random people. She was able to torture and kill the last man because he had forced himself upon her. She would still torture the man if Fleshcook orders her to do so, but she won't be able to do it on her own, out of desire, like the crossed. This exchange between Fleshcook and Julie turns into a debate about Beauregard Salt's plan for the merge. Julie argues that the merge was intended so that the crossed and humans could bring the best of their worlds to the table. The idea wasn't to make humans a copy of the crossed, or vice versa. Fleshcook realizes what Julie is saying and ponders on it, while eating a piece of skin he just tore off of the man's face. Julie then confesses that it is easier to torture someone when you hate them, but more easier if you don't know them at all. She knew this man. His name was Soldier Trujillo. He was a decent man with family. He never forced anyone from support to have sex with him. Fleshcook and Julie walk away while leaving Trujillo still tied to the post as Fleshcook continues to understand the ways of humans. Julie tells him that harming children is blasphemous and a big no-no because they have room to grow and they haven't done anything to deserve any kind of violence. That isn't the case for adults, because if you've lived that long, you've likely done something to deserve it at some point in your life. The two again part ways outside the brass washroom as Julie is horrified by the conclusions Fleshcook is arriving at after this conversation. He thinks that deceiving someone into hating their loved ones would prove to be a lovely way to get them to do what he wants. He laughs maniacally and walks away as Julie is momentarily distracted by a nearby commotion. It's Ballsack, and she is trying to take away the baby from one of the women involved in the experiment alongside Julie. Julie intervenes, and this makes Ballsack explode. The confrontation between them heats up, and Ballsack's disdain for the experiment is out in the open until Fleshcook steps in and stops Ballsack from doing the unthinkable. Ballsack then reveals that the newly turned crossed were growing restless, which is why she was taking the baby to them to keep them satiated. Fleshcook orders her to stand down, and a confrontation between Ballsack and him begins this time. The woman runs away with her baby in her arms, while Ballsack tells Fleshcook that she doesn't understand his experiment. Bashful has already shown them how to break the humans through torture, so why try something new? Fleshcook's men by now have reached the scene, and this has forced Ballsack to retreat, but her last words threaten a mutiny, something Julie has been dreading for a while now. Fleshcook walks away with Julie and tries to apologize to her, but Julie can't take this anymore. She can't understand his behavior, and so she bursts. She reveals to him that she heard him promise Ballsack that she could have her way with Julie once the experiment was done, and this is when Fleshcook reveals that he has been lying to Ballsack in order to use her and other disciples of Sleepy to his advantage. Fleshcook has dragged Julie into the archive to keep the conversation private, but when she continues to confront him, something inside Fleshcook falters. For some reason, from his perspective, Julie should already know why he cares for her so much. He comes close to touching her in this vulnerable moment, but then simply walks away without saying anything. Julie spends the next few days contemplating her choices and what she should do. She goes through the motions of the experiments without hesitation, but inside she is conflicted. She knows that if Nathan takes over the base and learns about the experiment, they all will likely be killed for what they have done and are now capable of doing. His promise won't matter, and what's worse is that soldiers will go back to their old ways, likely torturing support more and more this time. On the other hand, if she sides with Fleshcook, their days are numbered anyway. They would either be attacked by Nathan and succumb, or they will have to face a mutiny, something Julie knows will happen any day. And so, after much contemplation, and after spotting the shoddy job being done by Balsac and her crew while repairing the wall, Julie makes her decision. She decides to side with Commander Nathan. Coincidentally, the night Julie chooses to tell Nathan about the weak spot in the wall is also the night Balsac chooses to rile up the other Crossed in an act of mutiny. She claims Fleshcook's ways are unholy, says that he is going against Beauregard Salt's plan. Everything was already laid out for them. The merge is possible, but there are only two roles for humans when the merge happens, either slaves or either prey. This is enough for all of them to rally behind her, and the mutiny has begun. Crossed +100 American History X, year 2090, The Circle. Nears the end, a Crossed teenager is running through a huge high-rise building while being chased by at least a dozen survivors armed to the teeth. In an attempt to save himself, he leaps off of the 3rd floor and down into the pit below. We learn that this is the city of Baltimore, and for the past few months, the survivors have been carrying out regular sweeps to kill all of the Crossed in the city. The charge is led by a man named Bloom, and to him and the others, killing Crossed every day is a game, and they all compete for high scores. Bloom has killed 14 today, and it's his personal best. We then see that the Crossed teenager has survived the jump, and he is currently running through the streets and decides to take his chances to survive by heading inside a nearby house. Unfortunately, the house is full of supplies, and it is likely one of the safe houses used by the survivors. The worst then happens when he hears Bloom and the others entering the same safe house. The Crossed teen desperately pulls apart some floorboards, shoves himself underneath them, and hides patiently. Bloom decides to take the first watch, and although he first suspects something is underneath the floor, the Crossed teen manages to stay quiet enough to not rouse any suspicion. When it seems Bloom has slept, he gets out of the floor and tries to make his escape. Sadly, Bloom was only acting, and he shoots the Crossed directly in the head when he lunges at him. He then dresses up in protective gear, nonchalantly picks up the body, and then throws it in the mass grave they created today outside the safe house. Crossed +100 Mimic. Chapter 4 Vital Choices. It has now been some time since we last caught up with Julie, and she has grown more adept and proficient at her training. We catch up with the subjects of the experiment in the middle of a Crossed assault, and they are now more ruthless, more brutal, and more calculative. They kill off the Crossed with utmost precision, and Julie has grown quite good at leading the charge. She holds them back when one of them succumbs to the Crossed and focuses their attention on wiping the rest of the Crossed. Once that is done, she swiftly and expertly ends the turned subject's pain by slicing her head in half. Fleshcook applauds her for how far she's come, and she doesn't hold back her views when expressing that some in her team are still squeamish when it comes to killing, and she and the rest of them don't know how they will react when Fleshcook and his forces decide to attack other settlements. Fleshcook, however, appreciates her honesty and candor. That day in the mess hall, Julie is confronted for being too invested in the experiment by the other woman, but Julie says that she has to do her part honestly if Fleshcook and the rest are to believe her. She even adds that the woman didn't mind Julie being this involved when she saved her baby from Balsac. This is when their conversation is interrupted by Fleshcook, who leads Julie to the archive to talk with her. The two of them talk, and Julie expresses that she doesn't think the merge is going to work. Her people, humans, will never indulge in willing murder, sexual assault, and torture. But Fleshcook shows her that they need to do this for the good of society. He tells her that humans just don't like confronting their shortcomings, and Salt knew this, which is why he planned the merge. Humans destroyed the Earth while ignoring all the signs of their actions. He tells her that they can make the merge possible, create a society where the humans keep the Crossed in check, and the Crossed keep a leash on human ambitions. Julie panics and tells Fleshcook that though theoretically his dream seems feasible, practically it isn't possible. How will they deal with the Crossed that aren't intelligent? And even the intelligent Crossed, how would the humans keep them satiated? Supply them with other humans for food? Fleshcook then reveals that he has given this considerable thought. He theorizes that people that don't fit in with human values and societies will be handed over to the Crossed, and the Crossed that are not trainable will serve as food. He says they will have to start here, take things as they come, and persevere until society forms itself over time. Julie is taken aback when Fleshcook tells her that this is the only way now, the only good path for both the humans and the Crossed, a way to avoid bloodshed, a way just like the one humans take until survival forces them to fight amongst themselves and only care for those they love. He then does the unthinkable. Fleshcook opens his arms and tells Julie that he is at her mercy when it comes to initiating the merge. He will do anything that she tells him to do. This has now happened twice to Julie. Two people she never thought would even look at her as a human have now offered their full trust to her. First, it was Commander Nathan, and now it's Fleshcook. Julie, although taken aback, happily welcomes this power. She starts by telling Fleshcook that combat training is a good start. It makes them feel powerful, but that they will need to do something about the breeding pens. Treating humans like sheep won't help their cause. Fleshcook agrees, but before they can talk more, they spot Balsac and her army marching towards the breeding pens. As they get near, Julie spots one of the Crossed reaching into a bag full of chunks of flesh and dismembered body parts. She knows what this is. This is a bag full of biobombs, crossed flesh and fluid that the Crossed used to infect multiple humans from a distance. She thwarts the attempt thanks to her recent combat training and warns Fleshcook about the mutiny, but Fleshcook is taken by surprise, and Balsac manages to stab him in the torso. A fight ensues between the two, while Julie rescues the humans in the breeding pens. She orders them to run to the bunkers, and when they get there, they are to tell her team to meet her in the equipment room. The fight between Balsac and Fleshcook is raging on, and things take a turn for the worse when one of Balsac's men opens the door to the barn housing the untrained Crossed. Fleshcook, however, manages to overpower Balsac and has her on the ground now. But that is when he sees the untrained army of the Crossed running towards him. However, this is when Julie and her team arrive on the scene, and they begin to take down the untrained Crossed with relative ease. One by one, they all fall down, and although Balsac manages to land a few good hits, the fight ends when Fleshcook bites and rips her throat out. He then orders the Crossed fighting against him to stand down. They can either go back to their jobs or die in vain. The choice is theirs, and so most of them decide to give in and rally up the untrained Crossed back into the barn where they were first kept. This is when Fleshcook reveals to Julie that he is badly hurt, and he is quickly taken into the infirmary by her. One of the members of her team is trained in emergency medicine, and so she quickly gets to work trying to fix Fleshcook. She tells Julie that she will take care of Fleshcook, and this is when Fleshcook gives Julie the shock of her life by saying, "Listen to her. You have better things to do. You have a call to make." We then see Julie leave Fleshcook on the gurney and abruptly run into the brass washroom. There, the radionet communicator is already ringing, and Commander Nathan is on the other end. He is saying, "CC Nathan to Archivist Julie. Reinforcements have arrived. What is your status?" Over. Archivist Julie. CC Nathan to Archivist Julie. Are you there? Archivist Julie. And Julie is simply staring at the communicator, contemplating her choices and decisions once again. Crossed Plus 100, American History X, year 2096, Breeding Pits. A gangly and animalistic Crossed looks up at the light shining down into the subway and then quickly runs away as we see a group of survivors climb down into it. The group includes Bloom from the previous story we covered. He has traveled to New York and is continuing his mission of helping survivors clear out cities and kill off any Crossed that threaten their society. The survivors are quite relaxed because they have only encountered killed 5 or 6 Crossed in the past weeks, and they think that the Big Apple is almost cleansed. Bloom tells them to keep their guard up because the Crossed are smart, and he then tells them the story about the one Crossed that hid under the floorboards in Baltimore. The survivors also tell us about the rumors of inbred Crossed families that survive in the sewers and subways, something they consider to be an urban myth. But we then see that isn't the case at all, because the Crossed we saw earlier has now run back to his family and has alerted them of the survivors in the subway. These Crossed are quite grotesque, misshapen, and suffer from various genetic deformities, likely a cause of the inbreeding over the last 10 decades. As Bloom finishes his story, the unthinkable happens and one of the women of the group gets ambushed by 3 Crossed at once. They instantly tear her body to shreds, and by the time they all regroup and check their surroundings, it's already too late. Hundreds of the Crossed surround them on all sides, and no matter how many they kill, they will soon run out of bullets. Bloom tells them their only chance is to contact the other survivors, but before he can say more, one of the Crossed manages to evade his bullets and ends up gouging his eyes out. Bloom then dies after the Crossed bites and eats his throat, and this is when the older man from the group has an idea once he sees the Crossed communicating with each other through a series of grunts and clicks. He uses an air horn, and this incapacitates all of the Crossed instantly. Living and breeding underground over the years seems to have given them extremely sensitive ears. While the Crossed are incapacitated from the horn, they quickly shoot and kill them by the dozen. And this is when the other survivors find them thanks to the air horn, and they will now finish the job. Sadly, this is the end for Bloom. Crossed Plus 100, Mimic Chapter 5, Choice of a Better Life. And so we catch up with Archivist Julie once again as she talks with Commander Nathan over the radio. It seems she has made her choice, has chosen whose side she is going to take in this conflict. It seems she has chosen the Crossed, chosen Fleshcook. Because when Nathan asks if the reinforcements should attack right now, she tries to delay them by saying that the mutiny planned by Berserk is about to begin. Julie is visibly shaking because she is betraying her own species. She bites her lower lip as Nathan tells her that he will wait, but meanwhile move the forces a bit closer to the compound and sends scouts ahead to get a layout of the area. He also asks Julie to free the captive soldiers when the fight begins, as someone attacking from the inside would be tremendous help. Julie's voice is audibly shaking, so Commander Nathan assures her that things will be back to how they were very soon, completely unaware and oblivious to the fact that Julie and the others are trying to escape exactly this, the way things were before. Julie tries to stall him further by sowing doubt that he might get spotted by Crossed scouting parties if he comes too close to the camp. She is doing this partly to delay him, but partly to prevent him from discovering that the mutiny has already taken place and that Fleshcook was successfully able to avoid it. But that is when we get a glimpse at the reinforcements, as Nathan tells Julie that he isn't worried about Crossed scouting parties at all. They are more than capable of taking them down on their own. We then see that tons of armed soldiers have gathered in the jungle as reinforcements for Commander Nathan to take back the city. They have at least 6 to 8 armed and fortified trucks that are equipped with heavy weapons like flamethrowers and more. When Julie heads outside, she is confronted by Fleshcook's immediate subordinates, a Crossed young woman and an older man. They are quite angry because the human medic inside the infirmary is refusing to open the doors to them. Julie reassures them that Fleshcook is all right and that they should trust her because he trusts her. Julie then boldly walks inside and learns that Fleshcook's condition is now stable, though he is going to be quite weak for a few days to come. We then see the medic is the same girl whose baby Julie and Fleshcook saved from Berserk in the last comic. We learn her name is Nancy, and she is currently suggesting that this is the perfect moment to kill Fleshcook. They could either murder him straight up or infect his wounds to let nature do its work. But this is when Julie tells her that Nathan's forces are mobilizing and the attack will happen in a day or two. And before that happens, the supports that have been trained by Fleshcook for the past few months or so need to make their choice. They all need to choose a side because Julie has already decided. At first, Nancy is hysterical, but when Julie reminds her of how the support were treated, how someone will eventually snitch on them, and how Commander Nathan will kill them when he learns that they killed soldiers on on Fleshcook's orders and their own volition, Nancy comes around. She realizes that things before the Crossed takeover were much worse for them. Nancy begins to entertain the idea of the merge, the new take on the idea thanks to Julie and Fleshcook's experiments. Julie tells Nancy that in this war, intelligence is what makes one a soldier, and it's about time the supports that are smarter than the soldiers were promoted to Commander-in-Chief. Nancy tries not to make the choice right away, but Julie tells her that she and the rest need to make their choice as soon as possible, because if they don't, either side will end up making the choice for them. We then catch up with Julie as she updates her journal and writes her conflicts down, which also lets us know that the attack on Casper Compound is less than 2 days away. It seems Julie has been reading the book A Rumour of War, but her thoughts are interrupted when Fleshcook's right hand, the young woman, comes to fetch her. Fleshcook has gotten a bit better, and he thanks Julie and her team for helping them. Julie says that she was making the right choice. Balsac was a mutual enemy. Fleshcook fails to get up from the bed without hurting himself, and this is when Julie decides to reveal her choice to him. She says that the Crossed need to prepare for the attack. She then reiterates and says that they need to prepare for the attack, heavily implying that Julie and the rest of the supports have decided to join the Crossed in order to survive the attack and to prevent Commander Nathan and his forces from taking over. She then reconvenes with Fleshcook's right hands in the war room and wins their trust by telling them the truth of her allegiance to them. When it comes to the Crossed, torture, murder and sexual assault is a one-time thing. After that, you're turned and that's the end of it. But under Commander Nathan's rule, it was a lifetime of torture and sexual exploitation for all of them, which is why making this choice was rather easy for them. The two Crossed look at each other and grin, clearly accepting Julie as one of their own. We then see Julie preparing all the forces and factors at her disposal for the attack. She is rallying her team of supports, gaining the trust of those they rescued from the breeding pen, as well as lying to the soldiers that have been held captive by the Crossed. She is also regularly conducting strategy meetings with Fleshcook's immediate subordinates, during one of which we see the old man get aroused by Julie, but quickly correct himself and apologize to her, something the Crossed have never been known to do in the past 100 years. We then see Julie's plan work out just as she had planned. One of Nathan's scouts has relayed the information Julie had already confirmed to him. He is told that the mutiny from within has already occurred and the compound has lost a few dozen Crossed in the process. This earns Julie Nathan's trust while emboldening his overconfidence for the attack. We see him visualize the plan in the sand for his team. 1/3 of their force will attack the main gate, and while the Crossed are occupied there, Nathan and the remaining forces will barge in through the poorly repaired area of the wall. The operation should be quick and easy. This is when we get a glimpse into Nathan's true nature and why the supports hate him. When his own men ask him about what they are to do with the supports, the captives and the survivors, he tells them that they are of the lowest priority. They should kill them if they get in the way and only try to save his soldiers if they have enough time. The next morning the attack begins and it goes according to Nathan's plans. The front gate is attacked and the untrained Crossed are unleashed upon these attackers in retaliation. When the compound is informed of the attack, Julie's and Fleshcook's faces seem more determined than ever, as though they have already planned and prepared for it. However, the trucks attacking the main gate are unable to breach it and instead get stuck in it. This forces the soldiers to use flamethrowers on the Crossed, and Fleshcook uses this to their advantage by directing the untrained to use the truck's fuel to slowly roast the soldiers inside the metal trucks. The Crossed do exactly that, and before long the soldiers inside are unable to bear the heat. This is when the second phase of the attack begins, and Nathan alongside the rest of the other trucks barges in through the weak wall. The trucks are able to get through easily, and this is when we see Fleshcook and Julie solemnly oversee the attack. Fleshcook simply says, Now our faiths will be tested. Crossed, +100, American History, X, year 2020, 25, The Beacon of False Hope. This story starts us off by showing Salt and his cult of the Crossed when they were at their peak. They have a man and 2 women held captive as he teaches them about restraint. He is sitting on his throne while being flanked by his favourites, including Happy, Bashful, Sneezy and Sleepy. They're all quite young, but they are a witness to every proceeding Salt holds under his rule. A woman is brought to sit before him, and Salt tells her to control her desires by exercising restraint. He reminds her that they have practiced for this day, and if she does as she is told, she will pass the test with flying colours. Today, his selected elite, which are the group of children that will come to be known as Salt's most devoted disciples in the future, will be watching the test. He tells the woman to remember what he has taught her about restraint and then sends her away for the test. We then see that this is a crude method to test how much the crossed can control themselves while being willingly enticed. The man and the two women are being used for this test. They are all naked. The man has been laid down on a makeshift bed while the women are on their knees chained on leashes. He tells them about his plan, gives a sermon that to ensure their survival and to survive all of humanity's assaults, they need to exercise restraint. Restraint will also help them prolong torture and pain while minimizing loss of life, which will only aid in more torture and gratification. He then teaches them about instant and slow death. Slow death is the man's hand being slowly and brutally chopped off, while instant death is the decapitation of the two women the very next second. The crossed woman we saw earlier is then brought in, and it is clear that she has a fixation with genitals, and her real test of restraint is castration of the man while ensuring minimal blood loss to prolong his torture and thus their gratification. At first, it seems the woman is carrying out the plan excellently, but then she gets too excited once the process is done. Salt tries to stop her, but she gives in to her instincts and stops listening to him. She runs up to the castrated man and begins violating him, and Salt simply walks away from the scene, claiming the lesson to have been completed. The same night, the same woman is brought in front of Salt for the nightly sermon. She is covered from head to toe in the man's blood that she castrated, but she seems to be scared to her core. As she sits in front of Salt, we see her nails biting into her own skin out of sheer terror. She knows she let down Salt, but that is when Salt says something that surprises even her. He tells her that she did great. She did what she was supposed to do because she wasn't supposed to learn the lesson today. She was the lesson for today. She was the lesson, a lesson his elite, the children that he is grooming, were supposed to learn. She was supposed to be an example from whom his chosen ones will learn. He has shown them why they need to control their instincts and desires. He has shown them the consequences of failure and has shown them what is possible once they succeed. He then tells them that the crossed will eventually reduce in number, nature, and humans will take over, and they need to prepare for that, survive for the long game, and then prepare to be rebirthed anew 100 years later. As he says this to his children, we are shown his words coming true in form of the first attack led by the woman covered in human bones. In the scene where the crossed is shred to pieces by the lions, the crossed under the floorboards being shot in the head by Bloom, and then finally humans rebuilding settlements, followed by Bashful marching his armies to take over Tuga. Crossed plus 100, Mimic. Chapter 6, Unity in Desperation. The comic begins by showing us Nathan and his men barging into the Casper compound. Nathan is too overconfident, and seeing this side of the compound only confirms his suspicions that the crossed are stupid and occupied by the distraction at the front gate. This is when we see Julie and Nancy dressed in tactical gear, setting the captive soldiers free. The freed soldiers beeline for Nathan's truck, and he orders the rest of his men to protect them at all costs. His men do accordingly, and within minutes, Nathan is reunited with his right-hand man that was held captive in the compound. Nathan hands him a gun, and the man tells him that some of the supports, including Julie, were heard to have murdered soldiers on the first day. This instantly changes Nathan's opinion on Julie. He takes all of his compliments back and orders the man to kill the supports, including Julie. It needs to be done quietly to keep up the force's morale. He can't have people, especially supports, believing that they can have power. However, the next second his right-hand man chokes on his own tongue, then turns around and shoots at Nathan himself. Nathan dodges out of the way and shoots his man in the head, only to then realize that all of the captive soldiers have now turned into the crossed, and they have infiltrated most of the trucks. Julie watches this unfold from afar as she tells us what happened. She had used her intelligence and knew that the best infiltrators were those who never knew that they were infiltrators. She and Nancy had set the soldiers free by handling their restraints with gloves soaked in the piss of the crossed. It had worked as planned, and the infection was delayed by a few minutes, enough to give them the chance they needed. Fleshcook, meanwhile, is launching the next wave of attacks. His right-hand men are using infected arrows with biobombs to infect each truck that Nathan has brought into the compound. Soon it's all over within minutes, and Fleshcook marches over to Nathan to face him alongside his own elite force of selected soldiers, people he never cared for, his older supports including Archivist Julie. Fleshcook starts starts by ordering the recently turned Crossed to get in line and then confronts Nathan alongside Julie. When Julie reveals her betrayal to Nathan, the former commander calls her a bitch and lunges at her, but Julie is now trained. She promptly kicks him in the face and with a loud crunch of bone and cartilage breaks his nose instantly. Fleshcook then bends down, tells Nathan that he will be treated just like the people under him were treated, and then hands him over to the Crossed. Over the next few minutes, the remaining untrained Crossed are rounded up, and Fleshcook and his men now have new trucks and weapons. Julie is told to pack up because they all will be leaving the compound tomorrow. However, Julie goes to the archive to confront Fleshcook instead of going to the bunker. He pretends to be aloof to her question of what comes next by telling her that he has been planning extensively. But then Julie confronts him and Fleshcook confesses. They both love each other, but Fleshcook can't infect her more than her body. He is in love with her mind, and he can't let a mind like that go to waste. No one turns out to be a smart Crossed out of the blue. It takes years of conditioning since birth, and the only one known to do that on their own was Beauregard Salt himself. But Fleshcook puts Julie's helmet back on her head and then hugs her tightly while under protective gear. He tells her Salt was right, the merge is the future and we are its parents. The next day, we see Julie pretend to be one of the only survivors from the attack on Casper compound. She makes up a story for Nathan's death and claims that only one truck survived the attack while the rest were raised by the Crossed. Newcastle buys the story because they know she was Nathan's contact on the inside, earning her the trust of the settlement for now. They promise to have a welcome party waiting for her. As Fleshcook and the rest travel to Newcastle, Julie ponders about the future, and Fleshcook promises to slaughter any human or Crossed that stands in the way of their vision. Julie tells him that getting supports from these settlements to join them will be easy, but people from other settlements, the ones where a military rule wasn't practiced, will be harder to convince of their idea of the merge. Fleshcook reassures her that they will handle that problem when they face it. We then see Fleshcook and his men attack Newcastle and capture it, while Julie finds solace in the fact that Fleshcook was right about one thing. Anything the Crossed did was at some point in time done by the humans that came before them. She, Fleshcook, Nancy, and his right hands look over the horizon after capturing Newcastle as Julie writes the last words in her journal. The only way the weak survive is by uniting and fighting. That is what we have in common. Alone we die or live like shit, but together we have a chance to make something new. Crossed Plus 100, American History X, year 2108, Prospective Futures. And so before the story comes to an end, the final question is posed once again. Is Salt's plan over, or is it still going on, or has it just begun? Well, this last story sheds light on that. Till now, we have been reading the Mimic story from the perspective of Archivist Julie through her journal, but for this last story, we will follow the perspective of a Crossed young woman through her journal. The journal is written in broken English, while incorporating hillbilly slang used by humans and the Crossed 100 years later. But for the sake of brevity, we will be going over the story in normal English. The story starts by showing us the Bone Town near Chuga, the one where Bashful mobilized his forces before the attack. Joke Mercy marches through the streets while the young woman writes in her journal and tells us that today is her final lesson before the attack on Chuga. And today, just like people, they are supposed to write down their thoughts and their experiences for future generations. We then see the young woman alongside many other children sitting in the church while journaling. They are being looked over by a huge man wielding a huge sword as the young woman tells us that she feels as capable as humans. And she tells us that her name is Cockrip because, well, for obvious reasons. It has been her favourite activity since she was a kid. Through her memories, we see that this activity was used to condition her, to teach her restraint. As we see her succeed in showing restraint, we learn through her journal that she is completely devoted to Salt's teachings. She completely believes in him and can't wait for the day when the Crossed take over the world, just like Salt has planned. We then see the young woman being rewarded by her teachers for showing restraint, something that turned out to be a valuable lesson she holds close to her heart to this day. The young woman then writes in her journal that people live to create, they live to survive, but she loves to. However, before she can complete this sentence in her journal, the Crossed man behind her rages out of frustration and lunges at her in an attempt to assault her. The young woman struggles for a minute and then is quickly saved by the man in charge of watching over them. He nonchalantly walks over and decapitates the man on top of her. Without a word, the woman goes back to journaling and finishes her task, finishes the sentence that was left incomplete for us. Ominously, the teacher that just saved her looks at what she has written and smiles. We then see the young woman and participate in the charge on Chuga. She thoroughly enjoys taking over the settlement, and her smile knows no bounds. Just like before, and true to her name, Cockrip is allowed to torture humans in the settlement to her heart's content. And while she does this, we are shown the last line from her journal: "I live to make a future. The end. Marvelous verdict." Crossed Plus 100. Mimic is another banger in the series after the success of Plus 100. It follows in the footsteps of the previous series and expands the world further by tying in loopholes while introducing other characters into the world. It also expands and fleshes out the world of Crossed 100 much more, and gives us more glimpses into what transpired in these 100 years through the mini-series of American History X. The dialogue is much more consistent, and so is the art in this series. Cliffhangers don't overstay their welcome, while the twists truly manage to pull the rug from under your feet. Overall, if you have been reading the Crossed Then Crossed Plus 100 Mimic is an excellent read. The best part is that you don't need to read Crossed Plus 100 to understand this one, because the callbacks are minimal and some revelations work best the other way around. All in all, Crossed Plus 100 Mimic is an excellent addition to the Crossed universe.